She was left at the altar with a newborn baby girl, until the silent rancher walked in and took them. The snow fell harder that morning, like the sky itself had chosen to mourn with her. Her dress clung damp against her skin, streaked with mud and blood, torn from the frantic run that had carried her from the church doors into the wilderness. She clutched the newborn girl to her chest, swaddled in the only blanket she had, her breath coming in sharp, desperate bursts that mingled with the icy air. Behind her, the church bell had tolled its wedding call, but no groom had stood waiting. Instead, whispers had risen, cruel and sharp, as though the sound itself had pushed her into the storm. She staggered through the snow, her body shaking with exhaustion, her heart torn between rage and sorrow. Every cry from the baby cut through her fear and reminded her of why she had to keep moving. Somewhere behind, the image of the man who had promised her forever now seemed a cruel specter. He had left her there, abandoned with the child in her arms, as though her life and her future could be discarded with a shrug. Her feet sank deeper into the drifts, and still she pressed forward, her mind clouded with one thought: survival. Blood seeped through her skirts, a reminder of the birth still raw in her body. Each step threatened to break her, but she could not stop. She would not stop. For the sake of the tiny bundle against her breast, she had to find shelter, she had to find a reason to keep breathing. The world tilted, the strength drained from her bones, and at last she fell to the snow. The baby whimpered, tiny fists trembling in the cold, and she held the child closer, her tears freezing against her cheeks. A wooden church loomed in the distance, its cross cutting into the gray sky. She dragged herself nearer, crawling when her legs could no longer hold her. Her vision blurred, her breath shallow. She collapsed at last, cradling the infant above her own broken body, whispering a prayer she was not sure anyone would hear. And then, boots in the snow. A shadow fell across her. She blinked against the white world and saw him. A man dressed in worn rancher's clothes, his face hardened by years of silence and solitude, his presence as steady as the mountain itself. He did not speak, not at first. He simply looked at her, then at the child she shielded even in her weakness. His horse stamped behind him, its breath clouding in the bitter air. She tried to form words, to beg him not to leave them there. Her lips trembled, and all she could manage was a rasp of sound, nothing more. But the rancher knelt. He gathered her, bruised and battered, and the baby, fragile and crying, into his arms as though their weight was nothing at all. His silence was not cruel. It was heavy, solemn, like a vow. Without a word, he carried them away from the church, away from the place of abandonment, and toward the warmth of a cabin hidden in the pines. By the time the fire crackled in the hearth, she drifted in and out of sleep. The baby lay wrapped in a basket, the glow of the flames painting the child's face in gold. She stirred awake to find the man moving with quiet purpose, fetching water, tending the fire, setting bread near the coals. He did not look at her with pity, nor with judgment. His eyes were steady, carrying a depth she could not name. She sat weakly at the table, pulling the shawl he had given tighter around her shoulders. The baby stirred in the basket, and she reached instinctively for her child, kissing the tiny forehead. For the first time since the world had collapsed around her, she felt safe. He remained a silent figure, moving only when needed, speaking not at all. And yet, in his silence, there was a comfort, a strange, unspoken promise. Days turned into nights, and each one wove her more tightly into the quiet life of the cabin. She mended her strength by the fire, cradling her child, watching him move about the small space. His silence began to feel less like absence and more like refuge. There were no whispers of betrayal here, no sharp words of abandonment, only the sound of wind against the cabin walls, the crackle of fire, and the steady presence of the rancher who had found her in the snow. Sometimes, when the baby's cries pierced the night, he would rise before she could, rocking the child in his arms, his movements slow and sure. She watched him once, in the firelight, his strong hands holding the fragile infant with the gentleness of a man who understood loss too deeply to let it touch another soul. She never asked why he was alone, why his life seemed carved from silence. She only knew that in that silence, she and her child had been given a second chance. The memory of the church still haunted her, the shame of abandonment clinging like a scar. But when she looked at her daughter, when she watched the rancher's silent strength, she began to believe in something new. Perhaps not love as she once dreamed of it, adorned with vows and music, but something sturdier, born in the cold and tested by fire. One evening, as the snow drifted softly against the windows, she reached across the table, her hand trembling, and laid it atop his. He did not pull away. His eyes met hers, quiet and unyielding, and though no words passed between them, she felt it, the unspoken truth that he had chosen them, not by promise but by action, not by words but by the silent vow of a man who knew what it meant to never walk away. The child stirred, gurgling softly, and she smiled for the first time without sorrow heavy in her chest. The fire crackled, the storm raged outside, and within the small cabin, a family had been born from silence, survival, and a love too deep to need words. The fire hummed in the silence, its warmth spreading through the cabin walls while outside the storm pressed against the windows. She did not speak, nor did he, but the weight of her hand on his was not small. It was a choice, a quiet step into trust, and he accepted it by not moving away. She had expected perhaps a shift, a hesitation, but instead he sat with her hand over his and let the moment last. The baby made a soft coo in the basket, a sound that cracked open something inside her, and she smiled faintly, weary but content. For the first time since that wretched morning when her world collapsed, she felt something steady beneath her feet. Days lengthened, and the storm eased. When at last the skies cleared, the world outside shimmered white, untouched and fierce. The rancher stepped out early each morning, breaking paths through the drifts, tending to his horse, gathering wood. She watched him through the small window, the cut of his shoulders against the pale horizon, the deliberate way he moved. He seemed like a man born of the land itself, one who carried its silence within him. She wondered if he had once spoken freely, if some grief had sealed his voice away. Yet she did not ask. Some silences were sacred, and his was one of them. Her strength returned slowly. She learned the shape of the cabin, the feel of the floorboards, the little stores of dried meat, root vegetables, flour, beans. She kept herself busy, mending her torn dress, preparing meals, rocking the baby when cries woke her. In the evenings, she would hum softly, rocking the child to sleep by the fire. The rancher would sit near, whittling at wood or sharpening a blade, and though the space was quiet, she did not feel alone. Their silence was no longer empty, it was shared. One night, after the baby had fallen into deep sleep, she dared to speak. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice uncertain in the hush. He lifted his eyes to hers but said nothing. She searched his face, the lines of weariness, the quiet strength, and felt a surge of gratitude so fierce it ached. "I don't even know your name," she added. The silence deepened. He looked at her for a long while, then simply returned to his work. She should have felt frustrated, but instead she felt something strange, safe. His name, she thought, mattered less than the truth that he had not left her in the snow. In time, she began to move about the land with him. Wrapped in a heavy cloak, her baby snug in her arms, she followed him to the barn and the corral. He never hurried her, never made her feel like a burden. When she faltered, he reached out a steady hand. They repaired fences together, gathered kindling, cared for the horse. It was a life of small labors, but in those labors, she began to heal. The land, harsh as it was, gave her no room to dwell in sorrow. It demanded her hands, her breath, her will to endure. At night, she would sit by the fire and think of the man who had left her at the altar, of the whispers, the eyes that had pierced her as if she had been unworthy of love or loyalty. For a time, anger would swell in her chest, sharp and bitter. But when she looked at her child, her daughter's tiny chest rising and falling in sleep, she let the anger soften into something else. She realized that betrayal had cast her into the storm, but it had also carried her to this place, to this man who had asked nothing of her yet had given everything. As the weeks passed, she began to see small traces of his heart. Though he never spoke, his eyes betrayed gentleness when they rested on the child. His silence was not cold but careful, as if words might break what was fragile between them. She noticed how he lingered by the cradle at night, how he fixed the latch on the door to keep out the draft, how he always made certain her shawl was within reach when the cold grew sharper. These were not grand gestures, but they were vows made of action, promises stronger than anything she had been given before. Spring hinted at its approach with the slow thaw of the snow. The rivers cracked open, Birds returned in cautious flocks, and the cabin's roof dripped steadily with melting ice. She felt her spirit lift with the season. She no longer trembled at night with fear of what lay ahead. Instead, she felt something take root within her, a belief that perhaps this cabin, this silence, could be home. One evening, as the sky burned gold with the setting sun, she carried her daughter outside and stood watching the rancher mend a fence post. The baby reached out a tiny hand toward him, cooing. He glanced over, paused, and for the first time, a faint smile touched his lips. It was small, fleeting, but it struck her like a spark. She held her breath, watching, feeling her heart shift. That smile carried more weight than 1,000 empty vows. Yet the world beyond their cabin did not remain distant forever. News traveled slowly, but whispers reached even the mountains. One afternoon, a rider came, dusty, weary, carrying letters and goods for trade. He paused at the cabin, tipping his hat, his eyes curious when he saw her standing there with the baby in her arms. He asked questions, as strangers always did, and though she answered with caution, she could feel the world tugging at the edges of her new life. When the rider left, she sat in silence by the fire, her thoughts troubled. She knew there were people beyond these woods who still remembered her shame, who still whispered her name with scorn. The thought of them finding her here, of intruding on this fragile piece, filled her with dread. She glanced at the rancher, who sat sharpening a tool, his expression calm. He looked up, met her gaze, and though he said nothing, she felt reassurance pour from him. Whatever storm might come, he would stand. He had already proven it. That night, she whispered to her daughter, rocking her gently, "We're safe here, my love. We've found where we belong." The words trembled on her lips, but she meant them. For the first time, she believed them. Time moved, slow and certain. The baby grew stronger, her cries turning to laughter, her tiny hands grasping at the air. She watched the rancher with growing fascination, giggling when he lifted her high in the air. He would catch her laughter in his eyes, though never in his voice, and she began to wonder if perhaps one day, the silence might break. And yet, she also realized something else. His silence was not a barrier between them, it was the bond itself. Words had betrayed her once, promises had failed her, but this silence had never faltered. It had saved her life, held her steady, and given her daughter a father in all but name. The bond deepened with every day. She found herself humming more often, singing softly while she worked, filling the cabin with sound where once there had only been silence. Sometimes she caught him listening, his eyes thoughtful, as if her voice touched places he had long buried. She began to imagine a future, not the one she had once dreamed of, adorned in lace and vows, but one richer, grounded in survival, in trust, in love that required no declarations. And so the seasons turned. Spring gave way to summer, summer to autumn. The baby became a toddler, her steps unsteady but determined. She toddled after the rancher, tugging at his boots, laughing when he scooped her up with ease. Watching them, she felt tears rise, not of sorrow this time, but of a gratitude so fierce it nearly undid her. One evening, as the fire burned low, she laid her hand over his again, just as she had that first night. This time, she did not tremble. "You've given us everything," she whispered. "You saved us." His eyes lifted to hers, steady and unyielding, and though he said nothing, she felt the truth between them. He had chosen them, and she had chosen him. Outside, the world stretched wide and uncertain. But within the walls of the cabin, with her child safe and the silent rancher by her side, she knew she had found her forever, not in promises broken, but in the vow of a man who had spoken none and yet had never once let go. The fire burned low in the cabin, its embers glowing red as the night pressed against the windows. She sat near it with her daughter asleep in her lap, the soft sound of her breathing blending with the crackle of the wood. Across from her, the rancher sat in his usual place, a knife in his hand, slowly carving a piece of wood into shape. The silence stretched between them, but it was not empty. It was full of the rhythm they had built together, a rhythm born of trust, of survival, of days spent side by side. She thought often of the day he had found her in the snow. It came back to her in flashes, the sting of the cold, the weight of despair, the sound of his boots breaking the silence of her final moments of strength. She remembered the way his arms had felt when he lifted her, the way he had carried her as though she weighed nothing at all. It was not just her body he had lifted from the ground, but her spirit. He had carried her out of ruin and into life again. Her daughter stirred and whimpered softly, and she adjusted her, pressing her close until the baby settled again. She glanced up and caught the rancher watching them, his eyes steady, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought she saw something deeper flicker there, something unspoken, but powerful. She smiled faintly, offering him gratitude she knew he might never accept in words. Winter gave way to spring, and the world outside shifted. Snow melted into streams that carved through the fields. Buds pushed from branches, the earth softening beneath their feet. Life returned to the land, and with it, a new rhythm for their days. She walked more often now, her strength rebuilt, her body no longer broken from childbirth and sorrow. The rancher showed her the edges of his land, where fences needed mending and soil needed turning. She carried her child with her, tied close to her chest with cloth, and worked at his side. At first, she struggled. The work was hard, her hands unused to the roughness of it. Blisters bloomed on her palms, and at night, she soaked them in cool water by the fire. Yet there was pride in it too, a sense of purpose she had not known before. Each small task completed gave her strength, each day of labor carved away a little more of the shame that had once consumed her. She began to notice more about him, the way he always took the heavier share, the way he moved to shield her from the wind when it blew too sharply, the way his silence softened in the presence of her child. The baby adored him, reaching for him with tiny fingers, giggling when he lifted her high above his head. Sometimes she caught herself watching them, her heart aching with a tenderness that frightened her. She had once believed love came in vows and celebrations, but now she wondered if perhaps it came in silence and steady hands. The evenings became her favorite part of the day. They would sit together in the cabin, the child asleep between them, the fire glowing warm. She often hummed old songs, soft and low, filling the room with sound. Sometimes she saw him listening, his head tilted slightly as if the melody touched something he had long buried. She wanted to ask him why he never spoke, what grief had silenced him, but she could not. His silence was his own, and she would not break it. Still, she felt his presence as surely as if he had spoken vows aloud. Summer came with heat and long days. The grass grew high, the fields alive with color. She learned to cook with what the land provided, to dry herbs and hang them above the fire, to churn butter and bake bread in the small hearth. She found joy in it, in making the cabin a home. The rancher worked tirelessly, mending fences, tending to livestock, preparing for the seasons ahead. She helped where she could, her daughter toddling now, exploring the world with bright eyes and unsteady steps. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, she stood watching him repair a broken post. Her daughter toddled across the grass, her laughter ringing out like bells. The rancher paused, his eyes following the child, and for the first time since she had known him, he smiled. It was small, fleeting, but it stole her breath. She realized then that she had not seen him smile before, not truly. The sight of it stirred something deep within her, something she dared not name. Autumn arrived, painting the trees with fire. The air grew crisp, the nights colder. She wrapped her daughter in blankets at night, laying her close to the fire. She and the rancher worked side by side to prepare for winter, chopping wood, storing food, sealing cracks in the cabin walls. She felt a strange peace settle over her, a peace she had never known in her old life. She no longer thought of the man who had left her, no longer dreamed of the whispers or the shame. That life felt distant, like a story told to someone else. Yet the world beyond their valley had not forgotten her. One day, a rider arrived, his horse kicking up dust as he approached. He was a trader, carrying goods, letters, news. He greeted them politely, his eyes lingering curiously on her and the child. She felt the old fear stir in her chest, the fear that someone might recognize her, might drag her back into the past she had fled. The rancher stood near, his silent presence steady, and she drew strength from it. She answered the trader's questions with caution, keeping her past hidden, her present protected. When the trader rode away, she sat by the fire that night, her thoughts heavy. She feared the world might intrude, that whispers of her shame might find her even here. She looked at the rancher, who sat carving wood, his face calm, his eyes steady. He glanced up, met her gaze, and in that look, she felt reassurance. Whatever storm might come, he would not abandon her. He had already proven it once, in the snow, when no one else would. The seasons turned again, and with each one, her bond with him deepened. The child grew, her laughter filling the cabin, her small hands reaching always for the man who had become her father in everything but name. The rancher never spoke, but his actions spoke louder than any vow. He carried the child on his shoulders, taught her to walk across the fields, lifted her high to pick apples from the trees. He became her world, just as he had become hers. One evening, after a long day's work, she sat at the table, her daughter asleep in her arms. The fire glowed low, casting shadows across the walls. She looked at him, at the man who had given her everything without a word, and her heart swelled with gratitude so fierce it hurt. "You've saved us," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You've given us more than I ever dreamed we could have." He looked at her, his eyes deep, unyielding, and in that gaze, she understood everything. Words were not needed between them. His silence was not absence, it was promise. A promise that he would never leave, never falter, never abandon them. She laid her hand over his, just as she had that first night, and this time, she did not tremble. Outside, the wind howled, the world stretched wide and uncertain, but within the cabin, she felt safe. She had been left at the altar, broken and abandoned, but in the silence of a rancher's arms, she had found everything she had ever needed. The night was long, the kind of night where the fire seemed too small against the weight of the wind outside. She lay on her cot, her daughter nestled close, her breath warm against her skin. Across the room, the rancher slept in his chair, his head bowed forward, his hand still resting on the table as though he had not meant to close his eyes. She watched him in the flicker of firelight, wondering at the man who had saved her life and never once asked for anything in return. His silence had become a shield around them, a shelter stronger than the walls of the cabin. The child stirred, restless in her dreams. She hushed her softly, pressing her lips to her small forehead, rocking her back into stillness. It amazed her, still, that something so small could carry such weight in her heart. She remembered the first cry, sharp against the bitter air outside that church, how she had thought for a moment that life was over, only to realize it had just begun. That cry had bound her forever, and now the tiny girl was her reason for rising each morning, for enduring the ache of her past in the silence of her present. When dawn came, the storm had broken. Sunlight spilled across the snow, making it glitter like broken glass. The rancher rose early, moving with his usual quiet strength. He checked the stores, added wood to the fire, stepped outside to see to his horse. She wrapped her daughter in blankets and followed him into the morning. The air was sharp, but the sky was wide and endless, and she felt something inside her lift as she breathed it in. They worked together through the day, mending fences where the wind had torn them down, stacking wood, preparing for the days ahead. She found her hands growing stronger, her back straighter. What had once been strange and foreign was now familiar, splitting kindling, hanging herbs, scrubbing clothes by the stream. Her daughter toddled in the grass nearby, laughing at the sound of her own voice echoing across the fields. The rancher paused to watch her, his eyes softening in a way that caught her breath. She saw then that, though he never spoke, the child had given him a reason to smile. One evening, as the sky flamed with sunset, she sat outside with her daughter on her lap. The rancher was near, leaning against the fence, his gaze fixed on the horizon. She found herself speaking into the quiet, not because she expected an answer but because the silence had begun to feel like a space where truth could live. "Sometimes I think the world meant to break me," she said softly, stroking her daughter's hair. "But then I ended up here. With you. With her. And maybe that was the only way to find where I belonged." He turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. No words, no nod, no gesture, yet she felt understood in a way that was deeper than speech. She thought then of how much meaning silence could hold. She had once feared silence, once equated it with loneliness and abandonment. Now she knew it could be the opposite. Silence could be the place where trust lived. As summer stretched across the land, their lives filled with work. The child grew stronger, her legs steadier, her laughter brighter. She followed the rancher everywhere, her tiny feet chasing his long strides. He would stop, scoop her up, and carry her on his shoulders, her giggles ringing out like bells. Watching them, she often felt her heart ache with a tenderness so fierce she could hardly bear it. They began to shape a rhythm that felt like a family. Mornings spent tending to the land, afternoons gathering what they needed, evenings by the fire. She found joy in small things: her daughter's laughter, the sound of the rancher chopping wood, the smell of bread baking in the hearth. It was a life made not of grand gestures but of steady moments, woven together into something stronger than any vow. Yet the past lingered like a shadow. At night, when the child was asleep and the cabin was quiet, she sometimes lay awake remembering the church, the whispers, the way she had been left standing with her child in her arms. Anger would rise in her chest, hot and sharp, but then she would look at the sleeping form of the rancher across the room, the child safe beside her, and the anger would fade into something softer. The past had broken her, but it had also carried her here, to this man, this silence, this life. Autumn came, painting the trees in fire. The air grew cooler, the nights longer. They worked harder, storing food, chopping wood, preparing for the winter they knew would come. One evening, as the wind howled outside, she sat at the table with the rancher, her daughter asleep between them. She laid her hand over his, just as she had done before, and whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore." He looked at her, his eyes steady, and she knew he understood. Winter arrived with all its fury. Snow piled against the cabin, wind screamed through the trees. Days were shorter, nights endless. Yet inside the cabin, they were warm. The fire burned, the stores held, the child thrived. The rancher worked tirelessly, keeping the cabin safe, the fire strong. She tended to the child, kept the home alive. Together, they endured. It was during one of those long nights that she realized she loved him. It came not in a rush of passion, but in a quiet certainty, as steady as the snow falling outside. She loved him for his silence, for his strength, for the way he had carried her from the snow without question. She loved him for the way he cared for her daughter, for the way he made a home out of nothing. She did not speak it aloud. She did not need to. His silence had taught her that some truths did not need words. As the years turned, their bond only deepened. The child grew, her laughter filling the cabin, her steps steady and strong. She learned to speak, to sing, to fill the silence with her joy. The rancher never spoke, but his eyes told stories when he looked at her, stories of a man who had once lived alone and silent, now finding meaning in the life of a child. The woman no longer thought of the man who had left her. That life was gone, a shadow she no longer chased. Her life was here, with her daughter, with the silent rancher, in the cabin where silence had become sanctuary. The fire burned low, the wind pressed against the walls, and she sat with her family, safe and warm. Once, she had been left at the altar with nothing but shame and a newborn in her arms. Now, she had everything she had ever needed, built not from promises, but from silence, from strength, from love that spoke louder than words ever could. The winter did not relent easily. For weeks the world outside their cabin was buried in white, the wind howling so fiercely it seemed the very earth might tear apart. But within the cabin, time was softened by the fire, by the rhythm of their days, by the small hands of the child learning to shape her own place in the world. She began to speak more clearly, stringing words together into sentences, her laughter like sunlight against the dark of the storm. The woman marveled at her daughter's courage, this little girl born in shame, raised in silence, yet blooming in joy. The rancher had taken to building small toys from scraps of wood, rough little horses and figures that he would leave quietly on the table for the child to find in the mornings. She would squeal with delight, clutching them to her chest, and run to him with wide eyes. He never said a word, only gave a small nod, but his eyes softened in a way that made the woman's throat ache. Love was in those eyes, plain and deep, even if it had no voice. The woman began to understand something about him during those endless nights. His silence was not emptiness, it was choice. She sometimes wondered if the world had demanded too much of him once, left him so bruised by words that he had simply set them down. But what he gave instead was presence, unshakable and steady. He was there, always, with his strength, his quiet acts, his unwavering protection. That presence was worth more than 1,000 promises spoken by men who could not keep them. When spring finally came, it burst across the land with sudden force. Snow melted into rivers, grass pushed green through the soil, and the air filled with the scent of earth waking again. The child, now sturdier on her feet, ran across the fields with her arms flung wide, as though she could catch the whole sky in her embrace. The rancher followed close behind, his long stride never far from her small steps. The woman watched them from the doorway, sunlight on her face, and thought to herself, this is what it means to be alive again. The land demanded work, and they gave it. Together, they planted, mended, built. She found herself side by side with him, her hands roughening as she learned to carry, to lift, to endure. Sometimes, when the day's work was done and the air was sweet with evening, they would sit together on the porch, watching the child play. She longed to speak the truth blooming in her chest, to tell him she loved him, but she held it close. Perhaps he knew already. Perhaps his silence said he felt the same. One evening, as summer was just beginning, trouble came. Riders appeared on the horizon, dust rising behind them. The woman's heart clenched when she saw them, their eyes sharp, their mouths twisted with hunger and greed. The rancher stepped forward, his shoulders squared, his hand resting on the butt of the rifle slung over his shoulder. He said nothing, but the silence around him was enough. It carried a weight that made the men hesitate. They asked for supplies, for food, for whatever they could take. The rancher did not move, did not yield. His gaze was steady, hard as stone. The woman clutched her daughter to her chest, fear pounding in her veins. For a moment, she thought violence would come. But something in the rancher's eyes made the men falter, and after a tense silence, they turned and rode away, their curses carried off by the wind. When it was over, the woman realized she was trembling. She looked at him, standing tall and unshaken, and knew in that instant that she would follow him anywhere, into storm or fire or shadow. She whispered it softly that night, while her daughter slept between them, though he did not hear, I love you. Seasons turned again, and with them, the child grew. She began to ride the rancher's horse, her small body perched before him, her laughter ringing into the wide sky. She learned to plant seeds beside her mother, to feed the chickens, to fetch water from the stream. She was no longer the fragile infant the woman had once carried through a world of judgment and coldness. She was becoming a force of joy, binding them together with every step she took. And yet, the woman's heart still carried the memory of what had once been, the abandonment, the shame. She knew one day her daughter would ask where she had come from, who her father was. That thought haunted her, though she knew the truth was simple. Family was not made by blood, but by those who stayed. The rancher had stayed. He had chosen them every single day. Late one night, when the fire had burned low and the stars shone bright through the window, she rose from her cot and walked to where he sat in his chair, his eyes half closed. She knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. He looked down at her, his gaze steady, and in that moment she found her courage. You saved me, she whispered. You saved her, and I need you to know, I love you. The silence stretched, but it was not empty. His hand lifted, slow and deliberate, and he brushed his fingers across her cheek. It was the first time he had touched her that way, and it said more than words ever could. In his eyes, she saw the truth reflected back. He loved her too, in his quiet, unshakable way. From that night forward, something shifted. There was still silence, but now it was filled with knowing. They worked as they always had, side by side, but the air between them carried warmth, a shared bond that no storm or rider could break. The child, bright and innocent, was the center of their world, the proof that love could rise even from abandonment. Years would pass, seasons would change, storms would come and go, but the woman knew one thing with certainty. She had found her home in the silence of a man who never spoke, yet who gave her more than words ever could. She had been left once in the cold, but she had risen, stronger, with a family built not of promises broken, but of love proven every single day. And as she sat one evening with her daughter curled between them, the firelight painting the cabin walls, she thought of how far they had come. She reached for his hand across the table, and this time, he did not hesitate. His hand closed over hers, strong and steady, and together they held the silence as though it were the most sacred thing in the world. The years had a way of folding into one another, seasons turning so swiftly that the woman often marveled at how the little girl she had once carried was now racing through the fields with long braids flying behind her. The child was no longer a child but a young woman, tall and graceful, with her mother's quiet strength and the rancher's steady eyes. Life had taken her from a fragile newborn abandoned in shame to someone who carried pride in every step. The ranch thrived under their care. The silent rancher worked from dawn until dusk, the same as he always had, never needing to command, never needing to raise his voice. He simply did, and they followed, because his presence was enough to guide them. The woman had grown into her place beside him. She could mend fences, guide the cattle, cook meals that filled the cabin with warmth, and speak wisdom when their daughter sought counsel. Together they had built not only a home but a sanctuary, a place where love had been tested by storms and silence but had never faltered. But time, as generous as it had been, also brought its shadows. One autumn, as the leaves turned gold and red across the hills, the girl, now nearly grown, began to ask questions. They had expected it one day, yet the weight of it still struck the woman's heart like an arrow. "Ma," she said one evening, when the air was cool and the stars were just beginning to show, "who was my father?" The woman froze. The rancher, sitting nearby, turned his head slowly, his eyes steady on the girl. The fire popped in the hearth, filling the silence with its crackling, but no words came to the woman's lips. She had always known this day would come, had rehearsed answers, had prayed for courage. And now here it was, pressing upon her like the weight of a storm. She drew a slow breath. "The man who brought you into this world left us," she said, her voice trembling but sure. "He left us with nothing. But that was the day we found the one who truly loved." She looked to the rancher then, her eyes full of truth. "This man here, this quiet man who has stood beside us every day of your life, he is your father in every way that matters." The girl's eyes shimmered. She turned to the rancher, and in that moment, no words were needed. She crossed the room and knelt at his side, pressing her head to his chest. He laid a hand upon her hair, and though his lips never parted, the woman knew he had spoken more than any voice could carry. But peace never lasted forever. The past, like a wolf in the dark, had a way of circling back. One spring morning, riders returned, different from the men who had once threatened them, yet carrying the same hunger, the same greed. Among them was a man whose face the woman would never forget, the very man who had left her at the altar all those years ago, abandoning her with nothing but the infant she had carried. He had aged poorly, his eyes sunken, his mouth twisted, but his arrogance still clung to him like a foul smell. He looked at her with a smirk. "So it's true, you're still here, raising what's mine." The woman's blood ran cold. Her daughter stiffened, confusion and fury flashing across her face. The rancher stood tall beside them, his silence as sharp as a drawn blade. "She's not yours," the woman said, her voice low, steady. "You gave her life, but you gave nothing else. You left us to die. This man," she nodded toward the rancher, her voice rising with pride, "he raised her. He made her who she is." The man sneered. "Blood is blood, and I've come to take what belongs to me." The girl gasped, anger flaring. "You are nothing to me," she spat. "You left my mother, you left me. You don't get to claim us now." The rancher moved forward, his steps slow, deliberate. He did not reach for his rifle, did not need to. His silence carried the weight of thunder. The intruder faltered, unease flickering in his eyes. Men who lived by cruelty and noise often feared those who needed none. Still, he tried to bluster. "You can't stop me, she's my blood." But before he could finish, the rancher raised a single hand, palm out, steady as the horizon. The man froze. His voice cracked, his bravado shriveled beneath the force of that silence. He cursed under his breath, turned on his heel, and rode off with his men, leaving only dust in their wake. The girl turned, tears in her eyes, and threw herself into her mother's arms. The woman held her tight, her heart pounding with both fear and triumph. The rancher stood watch at the door, unmoving until the horizon swallowed the rider's hold. From that day on, the girl never asked again about her blood. She knew, with unshakable certainty, who her father was, the man of silence, the man of presence, the man who had never once abandoned them. Years passed, and the girl grew into a woman. She married a kind man from a neighboring ranch, with her parents standing beside her, the rancher silent but proud, his hand on her shoulder as she said her vows. Unlike the woman's first wedding, this one was not shadowed by abandonment but filled with laughter and love. The ranch echoed with music that night, and though the rancher never danced, his eyes glowed as he watched the woman who had once been left alone now stand surrounded by a family built strong. But life is a river that flows one way, and time spares no one. The rancher's hair turned silver, his steps slowed. Still, he worked, still he rose with the dawn, but the woman could see the weight of years upon him. She cared for him as tenderly as he had once protected her, cooking meals he could eat, mending clothes he wore thin, watching him with a love that had only deepened through the decades. One winter night, as snow fell soft against the window, he sat in his chair by the fire. The woman sat beside him, her hand in his, as she had so many nights before. Their daughter, grown now, with children of her own, had visited that day, filling the cabin with laughter. Life had been hard, but it had been full, and the woman's heart swelled with gratitude. The rancher's breathing slowed, his eyes, steady as always, turned to her, and though his lips never moved, she felt the words in her soul. I love you. I always have. He closed his eyes, and in that silence, his spirit passed, peaceful, unshaken, as steady as he had lived. The woman wept, her heart breaking, but beneath the grief was a fierce pride. He had given her more than she had ever dreamed possible. He had taken a woman abandoned, a child left to fate, and built a life of love and safety with nothing more than his silence, his strength, his unwavering presence. She buried him on the hill overlooking the ranch, where the grass swayed in the wind and the horizon stretched endless. Their daughter and grandchildren stood beside her, and together they honored the man who had spoken little but given everything. Years later, when the woman herself grew old, she often sat on the porch, watching the sun set across the land they had built together. Sometimes she spoke softly into the wind, telling him of the grandchildren's laughter, of the way their daughter had become strong and wise. She felt him there, always, in the silence that wrapped around her like a familiar coat. And when her time finally came, she went with peace, knowing she would find him again in that quiet place beyond the horizon. The ranch remained, carried on by the family they had created, a testament to love that had been stronger than abandonment, stronger than silence, stronger than time itself. The story that had begun with a woman left at the altar and a newborn in her arms had ended in triumph, not because of words spoken or promises made, but because of a man who chose to stay. And in that choice, he had given them everything.